Hello there. So I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and I've tried to get into things like Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. They're not bad, they're just, let's face it, not good old-fashioned Star Trek. But I've heard really good things about the Orville, which is a science fiction series very much in the sort of Star Trek ilk, written by Seth MacFarlane, the guy who wrote Family Guy, American Dad, and the Ted films. So I really wanted to check it out and see how it compared to Star Trek. It's quite difficult to watch it here in the United Kingdom, quite expensive. You can buy it on the likes of Amazon for about 15 quid for the whole season, but you don't get any physical media for that. So in the end, I opted to buy a DVD from Amazon, and I'm going to leave a link to that down below, because I think after watching this video, you may want to check out the Orville for yourself. Now, I'm pleased to say that the Orville is absolutely fantastic, and in my mind, much better than modern Star Trek. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why the Orville is better than modern day Star Trek. As always, if you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. There's also some channel membership options and some Patreon options in case you're interested. So let's get on with the list. At number 5, we have Aesthetics. The Orville ship itself, although I was a little bit sceptical at first, is actually very Star Trek-like in its appearance. So it's got a light bluish grey hull, it's got a sort of saucer section and the kind of warp drive or whatever it's called. As the first season goes on, you start to feel like it is part of the Star Trek universe, but an almost updated version of it. Even the opening sequence to the Orville is remarkably similar to the opening sequence of Star Trek Voyager, with the ship sort of flying past and going through the rings of planets. The similarities also extend to inside the ship as well. The interior of the Orville is extremely reminiscent of certain parts of the Next Generation and the Enterprise-D, particularly the crew quarters. There's a sort of minimalist 80s vibe going on. They look so much like the Next Generation, and this continues on to the uniforms that they wear, which are color-coded in a similar manner to Star Trek, but not in exactly the same way. And also the weapons, the sort of guns they have, look a little bit like Star Trek phasers. They even have what looks to be like tricorders. You could quite easily believe that it was just a variation or a development of actual Star Trek. By contrast, new actual Star Trek, like Star Trek Picard and Star Trek Discovery, they fail to recapture that original essence of Star Trek. They typically revert to things like a sort of generic futuristic thing with lots of holographic screens and things like that. It's either that or a sort of industrial appearance. And although I've called this section Aesthetics, it really is the kind of overall look and feel. We're talking about the musical themes, which are orchestral, the ranks of the crew members and the sort of terminology that they use, like the con. Obviously these are sort of naval terms, so the Orville isn't technically copying Star Trek, but it all makes it feel very familiar and very Star Trek-like. At number 4, cameras. One of the huge criticisms of new Star Trek, and I'm really talking about the films here, although it did carry through to Star Trek Discovery, and that is the ridiculous camera angles and fast-moving cameras, lens flares, that sort of thing. You have to have an action sequence nowadays that's shot at 1,000 miles an hour with loads of cuts, and it's so fast-moving that you can't keep up with it. That's the modern style. For me, somewhere in between Kirk fighting the Gorn, somewhere in between that and Star Trek Voyager, where, you know, you have fights, but they're a bit sort of sedate really, but yeah, you get the idea, there's a fight going on. Well, the Orville is very much in that ilk, probably more believable than the likes of Star Trek Voyager, and any CGI that's used in the Orville is fantastic, because obviously CGI has come on a long way since even Star Trek Voyager, so it's kind of brought all of those things up to date without, you know, inducing motion sickness in its viewers. At number 3, characters. So one of the criticisms about Star Trek Picard and Star Trek Discovery is the inclusion of so-called empowered characters that kind of try and forcibly educate you about sexuality, gender. Nobody likes to be preached to, and there really is a feeling in those new Star Trek things that they really are trying to sort of I don't know, belittle or patronise the viewer, because we all know that Star Trek is one of the most inclusive TV programmes there has ever been, ever since it launched in the 60s. Gene Roddenberry's kind of main idea was that the bridge was to be incredibly diverse, with people of every different ethnicity, from every different continent, and different races from different planets. So to sort of be told that Star Trek Discovery is pushing the frontiers of television by having a female lead of colour is, you know, kind of a bit untrue and annoying for people who actually like Star Trek. Now, the Orville pays an obvious homage to Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager with its range of characters. So there's Bortis, who is a very serious alien guy who looks quite a lot like a Klingon. We've also got an android, or an artificially intelligent life form, on the bridge of the Orville as well, you know, reminiscent of that sort of Data or Spock serious character. But these characters are developments of the Star Trek characters there, and they are unique in their own right. And indeed there are other characters like Alana, I think her name is, or not B'Elanna, I was going to say, that's B'Elanna Torres from Voyager, isn't it? I'm not very good with names, but there are other characters in the series who have very unique personalities and backstories, and you do become invested in those characters. So for example, each character gets their kind of own episode in series 1 where you learn a bit more about them as a person through some kind of lesson or moral story, which I think never really happens in Star Trek Discovery. They're so busy sort of preaching to you, the characters, that you're never really warm to any of them. Although, you know, people quite like Captain Pike, and I believe he's got his own series coming out now on the Enterprise, which, you know, could be quite interesting. I almost feel that that's like a little bit of a failure, really, for Star Trek Discovery. They tried to push the female lead and, you know, tried to be incredibly diverse, and they've ended up just launching another series with a bloke in charge of a starship. At number 2, the actors. Now, this is a bit of a bonus point, but I was quite shocked halfway through season 1 of the Orville to find a cameo from somebody who, you know, I had to kind of look and see whether it was who I thought it was, but Robert Picardo, the Doctor from Star Trek Voyager. I've delved a little bit more into it, and there are many Star Trek cameos in the Orville. Now, obviously, these people aren't playing their Star Trek characters, but it gives some kind of familiarity to the Orville to see these Star Trek actors. It also kind of gives it some credibility, like almost like it's got the acceptance of Star Trek, which, you know, I do appreciate. Now, you didn't get any of this in Star Trek Discovery. You got it a little bit to some extent in Star Trek Picard, which, you know, I think is better than Star Trek Discovery, incidentally, as a sort of separate point. But there's something a little bit less cheap about having an actor playing another role rather than just throwing in a casual cameo of Marina Sirtis and Jonathan Frakes to kind of boost the viewing figures and make it seem like it's got some link to Star Trek The Next Generation, which, you know, let's face it, it hasn't. So why are these cameos more fitting in the Orville than they are in Star Trek Picard? Seth MacFarlane is obviously a huge Star Trek fan. He has said as much. There have been sort of Star Trek segments in Family Guy. He is very passionate about Star Trek, and it seems to me as if the Orville really is his excuse to put on a captain's uniform and run a starship. And I think really his sort of passion for original Star Trek is what shines through in the Orville. And I think that perhaps these other actors, obviously they're probably being paid to take part in the Orville, but I think they possibly share in his optimism and his dream for a new proper Star Trek, and that's why their enthusiasm comes across as well and makes their cameos more fitting. And at number 1, the stories. We've talked about how you become invested in the characters in the Orville, and to do that, obviously, they need to tell a story. So Picard and Discovery tell their stories over the course of an entire season. And this is completely new to Star Trek. To some extent, Voyager had its sort of journey home, which was its kind of overarching storyline, and DS9 had the Dominion War. but still those episodes were quite discreet. And the beauty of having separated episodes for me is that firstly, you don't have to remember what went on in every preceding episode to understand what's going on in the current one, and also if there's an episode you watch and you don't like it, you can just forget about it and start on a new one. Whereas if you don't like the overarching story in Discovery or Picard, you're pretty screwed. Now, series like Breaking Bad are fantastic at this kind of storytelling over the course of a season. I couldn't watch Breaking Bad until the cows come home and not really care even actually about what's going on the screen. It's kind of mesmerizing to watch, and somehow, even though you're maybe not paying full attention all the time, you do know what's going on, you understand the story. Now, Discovery, I think, is notoriously bad at telling a story across an entire season. And they're not unique in this, but they seem to suffer from this idea that complexity means a good story. So the more complex I make the story, the more terminology I stick in there, the more twists I can throw in, the more interesting and compelling the story is going to be. Well, I don't find that to be the case at all. And the Orville actually reverts back to that sort of Voyager and the Next Generation style of storytelling, self-contained episodes, and you know what? They really are worthy of Star Trek. Again, like all the points in this list, you watch the Orville and you forget you're not actually watching Star Trek. So generally, they're episodes where they fly to a planet, or they come across a ship, or something goes wrong on the ship. They have to deal with the problem, possibly subvert the viewer's expectations in a kind of obvious way, not a sort of subtle way that leaves you wondering whether or not you've really understood what's gone on, and then it's all resolved, so there's a kind of payoff at the end and you feel like you've connected with the characters involved in those stories. It really is very satisfying to watch, and if you didn't enjoy an episode or you didn't pay enough attention, you're not buggered for the future ones. So that's my 5 reasons why I think the Orville is better than modern day Star Trek. I actually think that the Orville is the kind of the development of Star Trek that should have taken place. It's the Star Trek we all wanted, and I strongly urge you to check it out. Again, a link to the DVD down below. I would like to add a little bit of a sort of caveat here. I don't think the Orville is perfect. Okay, now I've only watched most of season 1, and if you read about online, you'll see that there is some criticism about the style of the Orville. The Orville is a strange mix of serious Star Trek-like science fiction and then a load of weird one-liners and Family Guy-esque jokes, which are a little bit jarring. It's an odd juxtaposition, which a lot of people have noticed, and it kind of puts a lot of people off watching it. But if you can ignore those weird jokes or kind of appreciate the odd one that is quite funny, it's definitely worth persevering and continuing to watch. And I haven't watched any of season 2 yet. I've just bought that as well to take a look at that. I've heard that season 2 kind of adjusts its focus slightly and is much better than season 1. Well, I love season 1, so I'll be interested to see what season 2 is like. Anyway, time to thank my Patreons and channel supporters. You are scrolling down the screen now. I also need to thank in person my Patreons who pledge more than $10 a month. So we've got Zachary Van Dyke, Damian Miller, David Robinson, Paul Cotter, and Magnanimous Meg. And I've had to say that 3 times now to say it properly. So blimey, that is hard work. Anyway, do consider supporting the channel if you're interested in my content, because I'm unemployed in 6 months. Thanks very much for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and I shall see you next time for another video.